What is good English speech? The answer is not very simple or obvious. It is easier to tell when speech is bad. When we listen to a lecturer whose words we cannot follow without an effort, or when he has unpleasant mannerisms, we are justly annoyed. When we are at the theatre and miss some of the dialogue, because one of the actors has not learned to use his voice properly, we are disappointed. We expect public speakers to take trouble over their speech in order that we who listen to them may be saved trouble. And speaking generally, they realize this and do take pains. There is a kind of speech that we expect to hear from them, and we will try and ascertain which among the many varieties of English speech it is. Let us consider some of these varieties. There are local forms of English, which we call dialects. We find them in the earliest stages of our language, when there was no such thing as standard speech. In the country, where the social organization is simple, pure dialect survives. In such a highly complex community as a modern town, speech varies greatly. There are many gradations, ranging from something like pure dialect to standard speech. Dialects have their special interest and charm, and have a rightful place in literature. But no dialect is preeminent in those qualities which we require of good speech. Dialect undergoes changes which do not render it less well fitted for conversational intercourse in a small area, but its development takes no heed of the requirements of public speaking or of artistic speaking. Next, there are temporal varieties of speech. Language is subject to change in course of time. The changes are sometimes due to the desire to economize effort. It is easier to say castle than castle, and breakfast than breakfast. Other changes, especially in vowels, are much harder to explain. Language is not stable and never has been. Minor varieties of pronunciation are to be found in certain classes of society. For a time it was fashionable to pronounce R's as W's, as may be gathered from early volumes of Punch. Later, people used to go riding and driving without G's. Speech also varies with the individual. Take two extremes, the pedantic and the slipshod speaker. The pedantic speaker tries to improve on standard speech. He goes one better than the ordinary educated speaker. He may utter certain vowels in what we call a mincing way. He dwells on certain consonants, the H in forehead or the T in often, which are normally silent. His attitude is one of superiority, and that is offensive, antisocial. The slipshod speaker speaks with the least expenditure of effort. He makes only just enough movement of his tongue and lips to suggest the sounds. He drops sounds and even whole syllables. Do you know her? Becomes Genoa. A basket of strawberries becomes a basket of straws. His attitude implies indifference or contempt, and that too is offensive and antisocial. While there always has been and still remains so much variety of speech, a growing tendency to uniformity has manifested itself, particularly in the last 100 years. Many influences have been at work. The great public schools, staffed almost exclusively by men from the older universities, have long served to spread a definite form of English speech. A boy who comes there with dialect peculiarities is soon led by his schoolfellows to give them up. The public school does not encourage anything eccentric. The remarkable advance in the education of women has had a similar effect. The average woman teacher speaks well, and the average girl has better powers of imitating speech sounds and a keener sense of the social advantages of good speech than her brother. The speech she has acquired at school she will later hand on as teacher or as mother. The effect of this teaching is especially noticeable in the modern type of secondary school. As a rule, the girls, and often the boys, in the upper forms of these schools, are quite at ease in the use of standard speech. The improvement in the means of communication, which leads to more traveling and to a more shifting population, also tends to favor standard speech at the expense of dialect. A man coming to a different part of the country will be inclined to give up dialect words that are not understood by those to whom he speaks, and he will, more or less unconsciously, modify his pronunciation so as to make it more readily intelligible. Teachers in particular often transfer from one town to another and have a strong incentive to use a form of speech that their pupils can follow without difficulty. The influence of the orator and the lecturer counts for something, for a great deal when they are broadcasting, because of the large number of listeners. The British Broadcasting Corporation have admirable announcers, but even they cannot be expected to be omniscient in matters of pronunciation. And it has been found necessary to establish a committee which recommends certain pronunciations of words that have more than one form in educated speech. There can be little doubt that these pronunciations will tend to prevail, and the general character of the announcer's speech will be taken by many as a model and a criterion of good speech. There is much evidence that listeners are growing more and more critical of the pronunciation of those who address them over the wireless. The stage also serves as a means of spreading uniformity of speech. The actor is rightly condemned if he mumbles or indulges in mannerisms. He is expected to speak well, to use a form of speech that will be acceptable in whatever part of the English-speaking world he may be performing. When we are in doubt as to the pronunciation of a word, we often turn to a dictionary. Those compiled by Walker and by Webster have exerted considerable influence on pronunciation. And now we have the Pronouncing Dictionary, compiled by Professor Daniel Jones, which gives the standard pronunciation, together with variants found in educated Southern English speech, of some 50,000 words. Last, there is the spelling, which, since it became uniform, has brought about certain changes in pronunciation. Especially in the last half-century, it has modified the form of words. If it were not for the spelling, we should probably all be dropping our G's. It is due to the spelling that we no longer say hospital and odious and education. The spelling is also responsible for such faulty pronunciations as forehead, often, statement, knowledge. The inconsistency of our spelling, however, is in the main an obstacle to uniformity. We do not feel the spelling to be a safe guide. Among other adverse influences, we may reckon that of the dialects to which reference has already been made, and a tendency to sound change. This latter does not affect standard speech to a very marked degree, especially as regards the consonants. We must make an exception for the R, which has in some forms of speech, such as Western American, seriously and harmfully affected preceding vowels, producing the unsatisfactory R or sounds. As an example of recent vowel change, we may note the substitution of oo for you in such words as absolute, luminous, Among educated speakers of the present day, there is a large measure of uniformity in pronunciation. As far as the individual sounds are concerned, it must be conceded that there is some unevenness in practice as regards the initial WH. The vowel R is sometimes modified in such words as dance, last. Some vowels in unstressed syllables are not pronounced by all in the same way. There are quite a number of words in the pronunciation of which educated speakers differ. In spite of these minor variations, we may claim to possess a standard speech, and it is essential that we should have one. We need it for general intercourse. Everyone can recall instances of men and women whose speech has gravely handicapped them in their careers. It is clear that the public speaker needs it. There must be nothing in his manner of speaking that distracts our attention from the thoughts he seeks to convey, whether he be preacher or actor, lawyer or politician. We need a standard speech for the aesthetic appreciation of our literature. It was never meant to be read with dialect sounds. To get its full beauty, we must be able to read it aloud in the best possible way. And when we read silently, it should still suggest beautiful sounds to our mind's ear. Standard speech is notably required by the teacher, who may have to deal with pupils possessing every variety of unsatisfactory speech, and who has to serve as a model for them. Only if he possesses good speech can he correct what is bad. A scientific knowledge of speech sounds will make him regard the dialect features in his pupil's speech as an interesting subject of study, and he will deal with them in a sympathetic way. If he is teaching in our dominions, he will be doing work of imperial importance in spreading the knowledge of our standard speech and counteracting the tendency to separate development. If he is teaching the foreigner, he will be expected to impart the best possible form of English speech. We are sometimes told that our speech is not as good as it used to be, and to this we may retort, it never was. The fact is that there is no time in the past when English was preeminently well spoken. And there is no evidence that the language was better spoken, for instance, 100 years ago than now. Are there sausage and sparrowgrass and cowcumber better than our sausage and asparagus and cucumber? Our speech has reached a certain stage which in its best form sounds beautiful to us. It is a speech that has gradually developed during some 500 years, since first the speech of educated Londoners came to be regarded with respect. It is based on the usage of the best speakers in the whole of the English-speaking world, though these sometimes differ in the pronunciation of individual words. The ideal speech for which we strive must be not merely correct, it must be pleasing. It is quite possible to pronounce every word aright, and yet with some ugly sounds, or with a grating voice, or awkward pauses, or faulty intonation. We should avoid sounds that are intrinsically bad, such as the glottal stop heard before the stressed vowel in after all enthusiastic, the affected oh no, and the retracted or in hot, not to mention the inverted vowels r, or in far, for, farther. Still more important is it to overcome any defects of speech, most of which, by the way, are merely bad habits. These should all be eliminated before the child reaches the age of 7. Too often they are treated, if at all, at a much later age, when the habits are deeply rooted and much harder to overcome. our speech must be distinct. We should articulate clearly, but need not think that every letter that appears in the spelling is to be pronounced. The T of Christmas and the P of psychology have no place in the spoken language. We must give heed to the proper production of the voice, learning to control the breath, avoiding all stiffness of the organs concerned in speech, not drawing the tongue too far back, encouraging free movement of the lower jaw, and making good use of the lips. The intonation calls for special attention. Otherwise, good speech may be completely spoilt if its melody is at fault. We sometimes remark on the very different ways in which two people will read the same poem aloud. It is mainly the intonation in which they differ. The dangers here are the two extremes of monotony and excessive variety. Monotony is produced most often by letting the voice fall at the end of every word group, which gives the effect of a series of disconnected statements. Excessive variety of pitch is noticed in the everyday speech of many people, and the introduction of these conversational inflections in the reading of verse has a ludicrous effect. Good speech is within the reach of all, if they will take some trouble to attain it. It is important from so many points of view that we cannot afford to neglect what is a duty and to reject what will give so much pleasure to others as well as to ourselves.